Today, Tabitha and I are gonna be talking about CRP required management. So during the presentation, you can feel free to enter any questions into the chat box. You should be able to access that through Zoom. If something comes up during the presentation, if you're able to unmute yourself, you can ask a question then, but we will have more time at the end of the presentation when we can address the chat questions and talk through anything that might come up. We're aiming to wrap up, I think, within about 90 minutes or so. So if we don't get to your question today, we'll have our contact information as well later on. So you can feel free to reach out to Tabitha or I. So just to briefly introduce ourselves, my name is Inga Rowan. I am a natural resources technician with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. I work in Rockwell City, which is in Calhoun County, but I also cover Sac Green, Webster, and Pocahontas counties. Tabitha, if you want to introduce yourself.
Some of you I might have met, some maybe not. My name is Tabitha Panis. I'm a farm bill biologist with Pheasants Forever. My home office is in Denison, Iowa, but I'm covering 4 counties of Crawford, Carroll, Sac, and Ida.
And then also on the call, we do have some USDA staff. I think at least some folks from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, maybe some folks from the Farm Service Agency, and we can definitely help connect you up with folks in your county. I think we might have some people who are from counties outside of Tabitha and my work range, but we're happy to help you get in touch with folks in your area if you have specific questions. All right, so, oh gosh. Hopefully I won't have too many technical difficulties. Here's basically what we're going over today. So we'll start talking about just what is required management, why you're required to do it, what activities you are able to do, what the time period looks like for completing it, the different management options that you have. So those are grazing, haying, disking, spraying, interseeding, and burning. Those asterisked ones, haying and interseeding, you can't do those alone, but we will talk about it more. And then towards the end, we'll also talk a little bit about ongoing CRP management. So just those things that you should be keeping up with throughout your CRP contract. So first up, what is CRP required management? So required management used to be known as mid-contract management. Basically, it's a required disturbance activity that was scheduled into your conservation plan when you first signed up for your CRP contract. So you might look out at your CRP and think, why would I want to disturb it? It looks nice, like it's doing what it's supposed to do. But for those practices that are required to do this, they're supposed to be what's called early successional habitat. So succession is a natural process in ecosystems where basically you think about a field of flowers. Over time, it gets more dominated by grasses. Those grasses, build up, you get lots of dead stuff in there. Over time, your grasses are going to turn into trees, and you can go all the way down the line to like an old growth forest. So especially when we're thinking about here in Iowa, our CRP practices are mostly grassland, kind of like prairie reconstructions a lot of the time. So we're looking for that diverse grassland habitat with those flowers. So doing that management helps maintain the diversity. So it keeps the different kinds of flowers and grasses. If you have thick grass that's building up, the management helps break that up or get rid of it. Required management can also help you manage any noxious weeds that you might have issues with. Can help you control woody vegetation over time. Volunteer trees aren't allowed in CRP practices. And then also to vary the structural diversity. So like Tabitha and I come in, we're really looking at the wildlife aspect of your CRP. And when you think about like little amphibians or those little tiny pheasant chicks the size of a bumblebee, it's really hard for them to run around on the ground when there's a lot of thick grass and material that's built up in your CRP. So doing this disturbance, doing this management helps get rid of that, open up spaces for those little critters, and maintain the grassland that they depend on. So even if it seems a little bit counterintuitive to disturb a nice stand of grass, these plant communities are resilient, and it is something that is required. So here's just a picture example. Can you see my cursor or no? Okay, so, okay, great. So we want to do required management. So we have CRP that looks like this picture here on the right side. So you see a lot of diversity, you see some tall stuff, you see some shorter stuff, you see flowers, and not like the CRP on the left side. So here it looks like it's probably all like reed canary grass, which is an invasive grass species. You see volunteer trees growing up, and it just doesn't have that same vibrancy, I guess you could say. Here's another example of how you don't want your CRP to look. This is out in the Lost Hills, but I know we do have problems with cedars in some other areas. So when you have your cedars or volunteer trees grow up, you don't have that nice diversity underneath. So doing the management, keeping those trees and older successional material off helps keep it the habitat that we're looking for here in Iowa. So what practices are available to you? When you first signed up or when your conservation plan was made, most likely there was one of these practices that was assigned. It's probably on the paperwork that you got from your FSA this year. But these are the practices that are probably available depending on what practice, what vegetation you're supposed to have, what issues you might have, what area it is. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. So in consultation with FSA and NRCS, the practices that you might have available include grazing, haying, tillage, spraying, interseeding, and prescribed burning. So haying and interseeding alone will not meet the requirements. You have to couple them with another management practice as well. And you can combine management practices. So for example, you might be doing spraying and interseeding, or prescribed burning and interseeding, or just different combinations, just depending on the situation and what exactly it is you're looking for. So looking out at your CRP, you might see some bad issues. You might see some good things that you have going on. We want to try to choose a practice that's going to take advantage of the good stuff that you have and help counteract any potential issues that we see. When do you complete your required management? So usually required management is required one time during your contract. The exceptions to that are a CP33, which is a bird buffer, or there are certain quail practices in other parts of the state, but not in the counties that Tabitha and I cover. And those will require more required management than just one time throughout the contract. So for most of the practices that we deal with, required management is required one time during the contract on all of the acres. So sometimes that's broken up. Sometimes it's all done in the same year. As far as a 10-year contracts, usually it's somewhere between years 4 and 7. For 15-year contracts, somewhere between years 4 and 12. And if it's a re-enrollment, sometimes you're doing it even earlier on in the contract. So just depends on what the conservation plan said when you first signed up. So here are the exceptions to times that we want you to do a third of the contract acres per year. So for contracts that are 20 acres or less, you can do all of the management in 1 year. If you're doing prescribed burning, you can do it all in 1 year. Grazing, you can do in 1 year. You do need to have a grazing plan on file. Approved tree and shrub plantings don't require required management in most situations. And then also if there's standing water, like in wetlands during the time period where you'd be doing the management, you don't have to do management to those acres that are covered in water. It's really important to recognize that you're not allowed to do this required management during the primary nesting season. So here in Iowa, the dates for that are May 15th through August 1st. So if you're looking to do management this spring, that's something that has to be taken care of before May 15th. So as I said earlier, you were signed up for something probably when you first signed the contract, but we can make changes to that just depending on the situation and what you have going on out there. Typically, FSA will require you to submit a request in writing to the county committee that's saying, you know, what you want to change, probably why you want to change it, whether that's the timing or what practice you're doing. And then you also need to make sure that the NRCS has made those changes as well. So here's an example where we have a producer who was signed up to do tillage on 1/3 of their acres per year for 3 years, but they decided they wanted to do a prescribed burn. And for burning, you can do all of the management in 1 year. So they just moved it all to 1 year where they're going to do all the management, and then it's signed off on by NRCS and by the producer. So next up, we'll get into talking more specifically about those different options for management, and Tabitha is going to lead off with grazing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Inga. I just requested control to
Yes, hopefully you
change
have
the
it.
slides.
Can you change it? There you go. Perfect.
There we go. Awesome. Thanks so much. So before I get into talking about our first few options, I just wanted to reiterate what Inga said. You know, you go out and you look at your CRP and you might have some things that are good. You might have some things that are bad. You might have an issue. You might have an awesome stand, and evaluating it before you choose an activity is so crucial, because some activities can make a problem worse, and some activities can really extremely benefit the landscape and the wildlife that's out there. So you want to, but every situation is different. So you really want to assess what you have going on. And so if you need help doing that, please reach out to Inga or myself or your local USDA service center. They would be happy to come out beforehand and help kind of make a recommendation for what activity might be best. So with that, I'll talk a little bit here about grazing. So grazing is one management activity that we can use for our required management on CRP. It must be done in accordance to a conservation plan and approved by the Farm Service Agency County Committee prior to completing the activity. So with haying and grazing, those two, you need to talk to the Farm Service Agency and NRCS first before you complete them, so we can get a supplement added to your plan and kind of have it planned out at the beginning. With burning, spraying, disking, you know, those are options that are just available to you. Go ahead and do them, and then document that properly to bring back to certify for us. But with the grazing and haying, you're going to need to talk to us first to come up with a plan. And so grazing can be done outside of the primary nesting season. And like Inga said, that's May 15th through August 1st. And so we have a spring and a fall grazing period. And so those two are going to be April 1st through May 14th. And August 2nd through September 30th. So with grazing, there are some stipulations. Heavy use locations need to be reseeded. Water and mineral are okay to put out on the CRP, but no supplemental feed is allowed. We're not turning CRP into a pasture. It's still supposed to benefit wildlife. We are just utilizing grazing as a management strategy in this case. So we don't want to be putting any hay or supplemental feed out for livestock. Stocking rates will be selected so that minimum stubble heights are going to be maintained, and that is 4 inches for introduced grass species. And oops, I went to the next one. And 6 inches for native grass species. So we're maintaining those stubble heights. And I'm not sure how to go back here.
I might have screwed it up. Hold on.
No, you're okay.
I admitted people, which maybe I shouldn't have clicked to do. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's probably what happened, but that's all right. Sorry about that. Glad we got it settled again. Okay, so like I said, minimum stubble heights are going to be maintained out there to maintain some type of cover. Grazing is a good land management tool. Prairies of Iowa have seen grazing for 12,000 years or more. They've adapted to bison, elk, and big animals munching. These species typically selectively graze on grasses, which in turn allows for more forb and wildflower diversity, which is good for pollinators. That makes more insects, that makes more food for the lowest level. So it's good for wildlife if done correctly. So no, there is no rental rate reduction for grazing as a required management, but we do encourage the interseeding of a forb afterwards. right, moving forward here, we're going to talk a little bit about haying. So again, like with grazing, you're going to need that haying in a conservation plan prior to completing the activity. And you're going to want to work with the Farm Service Agency and NRCS to complete a conservation plan supplement if you choose haying. And so there's one haying period. It takes place August 2nd through August 31st, and all bales must be removed off CRP by September 10th. We don't imagine to see a lot of this, as there's been a lot of emergency haying and grazing going on lately due to the drought that we've been in, but this could still be an option for folks. So haying alone will not meet your full requirement. Just haying does not meet requirements for mid-contract management. So you will need to pair it with another activity. Most commonly we see interseeding. However, it doesn't need to be interseeding. It could be burning, spraying, another combination. There is a 25% rental rate reduction for the year that you choose to hay. Only one cutting is allowed. We maintain minimum stubble heights, again, of 4 inches. And if it is hayed for emergency, which a lot of folks have done lately, you are going to need to wait 3 years before it's eligible again to hay. So we'll just have to pay attention with that, and the Farm Service Agency will have records so we can check where you're at in that regard. And then you're going to want to work with NRCS to determine if you hay all the acres at once or split it into separate years. With most of our practices, if they're above 20 acres, we do want you to split it into 3 different years. So that would mean if you have a 30-acre CRP and you're going to spray for your management requirement, you're going to want to split that into 3 and do 10 acres, 10 acres, 10 acres for 3 years of the spraying, since it's over 20 acres. We don't, as Ingo will probably mention later, we don't do that for burning. We recognize that prescribed fire is kind of a big task, and to split up some fields in that way might be difficult. So for burning, if it's above 20 acres, you still can burn it all in 1 year. Okay. Oh, and one more thing I was going to mention about haying too. It can remove a lot of thick grass and thatch that builds up, but it can be have a little bit of a negative impact for diversity as far as our forbs go. It's harder on our forbs and legumes, so that's why we often do pair it with interseeding. And so rules for both, again, must sign up before the practice is completed. Land within 20 feet of a stream or permanent water body must be excluded from haying or grazing. Food plots, tree and shrub plantings, or safe pheasant recovery winter habitat are not to be hayed or grazed. So those are 3 different practices, and it kind of makes sense. Why would you hay or graze a tree planting? Would be impossible. And then finally, participants will reseed at their expense if the cover fails as a result of haying or grazing. And it may not negatively impact the intended function of the practice. So if it's for water quality, we're not going to be causing a bunch of erosion on our banks and decreasing water quality. Same thing if it's wildlife habitat, where you don't want to tear up the cover too much. So a lot of the heavy use areas might need to be reseeded if that occurs. All right, next I'm going to talk a little bit about disking. So tillage is another option for mid-contract management. Disking can do a number of things. It can break up the sod, promote more diversity. It can help control woody species like trees, which volunteer trees are not allowed in CRP. And it can be used for fire breaks. So if you do want to choose to burn, you can use tillage around the perimeter of the field so that provides a really nice burn break. The fire can't escape. If you are going to do tillage for a burn break, we recommend 2 passes 2 different ways. So you don't if you just flip all the sod over one way, fire can still creep underneath. So you really want to break it up a little more if you're using it for a burn break. And then no other management activity would be required on those acres around the perimeter. So we recommend do not exceed 4 inches in depth, and we want to aim to see 50% at least 50% residue left out there on the ground still, and 50% bare ground. So this may require 3 or 4 passes. And I do want to mention this is not a great option if you have issues of any noxious weeds like the Canada thistle. Turning up the ground like this will really stir up the seed bank, and it could turn into a potential weed problem for you later on down the line. So I would not recommend tillage on an entire field when you have those weed pressures around. And if it's above 20 acres, we're going to rotate that into thirds, and you can till in blocks or in strips. And if you have steeper slopes like CRD slopes, you're going to want to use tillage along the contour to help prevent erosion. And then finally, mowing, burning, grazing, or haying may also be needed prior to tillage to assist in breaking up that sod. And so here's just a visual example of 50% residue on the ground, fall tillage. You can see what that looks like. And then here's that same area the following June. So you can still kind of see around the edges where the tillage didn't get done, like right along the tree line. It looks like there's a lot of brome in there. It doesn't look, probably for a tiny strip, not as diverse. And so here we see a lot more diversity, some broadleaves coming through. Some of these species can be good. Some of them could be a little bit weedier species. Annual weeds, we really don't worry about too much. Those will disappear. That's just Mother Nature saying there's bare ground and I'm going to cover it for a while until something else moves in. And so, you know, having this diversity is really important for wildlife, not only in number of species out there. We want different grasses, we want different wildflowers, but also structural diversity. We want some plants that are small, some that are larger. Wildlife, especially our pollinators, really will specialize to specific types of flowers, specific types of plants. And so the more diversity we can put out there, the better for wildlife. And so we have another image here. So 3 years later, this is kind of returned back to what it was before. We have, you know, maybe there's some forbs out there, but this looks pretty grass dominated again. So yeah. All right, next I'm going to move into spraying. So spraying is one other option to complete mid-contract management. Spraying, the purpose of it is to weaken our grasses and promote more forbs. So when we're spraying, we are using a grass selective herbicide. We're not using Roundup. We're using something that's just going to target our grasses and allow for more diversity in that way. Mowing or burning is encouraged before spraying. If you have an old stand that has a lot of duff, a lot of dead plant material out there, it's going to make your chemical application so much more effective to get some of that off, get some fresh green growth, and the plant will be a lot more ready to uptake it when, you know, you're not putting it on a lot of material that is not doing any use. It can be used prior to disking or interseeding. And we want to make a note that you need to follow all label recommendations. USDA, we don't make recommendations on chemicals, so you're going to want to work with your local agronomist if you have questions about specific chemicals to use. But we do just tell you that you need to follow all label instructions and use the lowest label rate that will achieve your desired conditions. A note to do not spray over open water or within 20 feet of a permanent or intermittent body of water. So if you have a stream, a pond, you're going to want to stay away from that. No, even if the CRP extends up to that water line, no additional activity will be required in that strip if you choose to spray. So basically you can just ignore that strip. That's going to act like a buffer, so we're not spraying too close to water. Yeah. And then one other note is I always tell people to think about what will be filling in the spaces after you spray. So, you know, if you have a lot of weeds, if you have something else, there's going to be something else that's going to move into it. So that's one kind of strategic way you want to think about it in the beginning. What do we have out here? What is actively growing when I'm spraying? What's going to be receptive to the spray? What's it going to look like afterwards? So spraying what and when? In our stands, we have cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and those are basically self-described. So the cool season grasses, we have 2 seasons of the year that those work really, that spray would work better for. Spring is one, fall is another. Fall might be a little better as things go dormant. They're tending to pull chemical back down into their root system. So those are just kind of the 2 periods that we have for those. Warm season grasses like big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. We want to use a grass targeting herbicide. Like here we have clethodim, for example. And those respond best to chemical application in the late summer or the early fall. So kind of when the hottest times of the year are, and those are actively growing. So. Oh, and we did have a note on that. I saw that it said Roundup. I'm going to go back here really quick. It saw that we said glyphosate for cool season grasses. You can use glyphosate to set back brome. And I think that's what we thought when we put that on there is brome or other cool season grasses can kind of move into native grass stands, and we don't want that there. Glyphosate is a really great tool at that time, but it's not going to count for our mid-contract management as we need to use a grass selective herbicide. So I just wanted to make that clear. And so that kind of falls under our other management activities that might be useful throughout the life of a CRP contract. And so here I have a picture. This is actually from my parents' place. We have a brome hayfield that we're transitioning into native cover. And so this was hayed prior to spraying. And as you can see, the cover is turning brown and not looking so well. We sprayed this in the last week of April of this year. And so this photo was probably taken around the big cup first week or 2 in May, I would say. And there was not a lot of diversity. Before it turned brown like this, it pretty much looked just the same except for green. It was pretty solid brome grass. And here is that same area just a few months later in the middle of July. So we have a lot of native forbs coming out, and this was an area that wasn't even seeded. This was kind of just maybe a seed bank that had been in this stand for a long time. So if you see a grass stand that looks like just a solid grass stand, it just definitely doesn't mean that there's not more out there. This spraying was done at a time when the brome was growing, so it really set back that brome. And our forbs and other grasses that were in this mix were not actively growing at the time, so they had no effect. And they were able to have some space and come through. So we have hoary vervain, that's the purple flower that you can see a lot in here. But we also had a lot of Culver's root, a ton of common milkweed and world milkweed. And we are transitioning this to be a pollinator mix. So that is our goal. And so this really made sense for us in the transition in the meantime. So just wanted to give a visual example of how herbicide use at the correct time, applied at the correct time, can really change what CRP looks like. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about interseeding. So interseeding alone is not going to meet requirements. We commonly pair it with haying, but we can pair it with burning, we can pair it with spraying. And basically the main goal of this is to increase flowering plants for our pollinators, increase seed production for birds, and add diversity out into our CRP. So before interseeding, we're going to want to assess the stand, address any weed issues or any other issues prior to seeding and doing that disturbance activity if you can, and make sure that any herbicide that you've used out there won't have a residual effect on your new seeding. So glyphosate is pretty short. You can spray glyphosate and seed fairly shortly after that. But some other chemicals do have a longer half-life and will remain on the soil and could harm germination of your new seeding if you choose to interseed. So again, we're going to pair that with another practice like tillage, burning, spraying, grazing, and haying. And so when we're interseeding, you'll want to work with FSA or the NRCS prior to picking a mix. We recommend source identified seed that complies with Iowa's weed laws. And we want to make sure that that seed makes sense and fits into your seeding plan of your practice. And so we will want to check over that just to be sure. And we can also tell you, if you need to make any adjustments. So the Farm Service Agency will cost share on forbs and legumes for interseeding, but they will not cost share for grass seed. And so you can add grasses into the mix on your own, but it'll be at your own expense. Grass seed usually isn't that expensive, although if you've been paying attention to the economy lately, everything is going up in price. So it probably will be more expensive than it has been in past years, but that would just be something to take a look at. Following interseeding, you may need an additional activity like mowing to aid in the establishment of the seeding. So after you put seed out there on the ground, new seedlings can't compete with old established stands or annual weeds that do all their whole life in 1 year. So they have to get really big in 1 year. A lot of our native seeds especially grow really slow. They put a root system down first. They're searching for water more than they're searching for sunlight. They don't compete for sunlight very well. So mowing is going to take the tops off of some big annual weeds, set back some of the existing vegetation that might be out there so that those seedlings can get sunlight. Sunlight is one of the biggest reasons that a lot of our seedings fail, is they just don't get enough sunlight because things outcompete them. So if you don't utilize mowing, you're just basically putting seed out there and saying a prayer. So we want to set you up well. And so the establishment mowing is going to be something you're going to want to do. And you're going to need to work with the NRCS and Farm Service Agency so that we know you're mowing out there for a reason, because just general mowing of CRP is not allowed. If you just like the way it looks or whatever that is, some people like to mow. We don't really allow mowing just for that purpose. So we're going to want to know that you're doing it to establish a new seeding. And so once it's decided, we're going to again go back to not disturbing that CRP during the primary nesting season, May 15th through August 1st. So seed selection, you're going to want to take a little bit of time to choose a seed vendor, choose a seed mix. And we do recommend buying yellow tag seed or seed that has been grown in your area. So that seed, it's going to be local ecotype and not come from 3 states away. The benefit to this is we're not going to be accidentally potentially introducing some invasive species that could be 3 states away, but we're also purchasing seed that has adapted to this area, to our climate, to our soils, to our weather conditions. And so that seed is just going to have a little bit of a better competition, a better advantage going out into the field because it has been around and is supposed to be growing in this area. So with forbs and legumes, our interseeding rate is usually we do 10 seeds per square foot, which works out to be 1/4 of a full seeding. So for most of our CRP practices, we seed at 40 seeds per square foot. And when we interseed, we're doing 1/4 of that rate. And so here is our seed plan supplement. And NRCS can provide this to you. This basically goes with your seeding plan. It kind of describes what all you might need to do with the seeding, the hydrology, the purpose of the seeding. And so NRCS can give you this document. A landowner would take this along with the seed plan that we give them to a seed dealer. The seed dealer might say, oh, we have most of these things, but we're out of this and this. And so then a landowner can check with us and say, hey, this is the type of seed that they have. Is this still okay? And most times it is, 9 times out of 10 it is, but we like to double check because we don't want to put something out there and have someone spend money on it and then we don't cost share because it doesn't meet our standards or, something like that. So always come back and double check with us if your seed mix changes. And so when we're interseeding, we can do that in a number of ways. The first way would be to drill or no-till drill. And you're going to want to drill forbs into a super shallow depth of 1/8 of an inch deep. Too deep and those forbs won't grow. They really like to be very close to the surface. So broadcast seeding is another method of seeding. And you can do that a number of different times a year. The main thing with broadcast seeding is you're going to want at least 50% bare ground so that you can get good seed to soil contact when you put the seed out there. Since you're putting it right on top of the ground, you're not going to want to put it on a stack of 2 feet of duff or vegetation that's out there. That's not going to work. So, you know, utilizing a prescribed fire, utilizing tillage beforehand might be a couple good ways to get good seed to soil contact. And then finally, rolling with a multi-packer afterwards will help kind of pack that seed in. It might help it from getting predated by birds or mice. And so, yeah, frost seeding is another method that you can use. This is when the ground is freezing and thawing, and those freezing and thawing cycles will incorporate the seed. And so putting seed out there at that time is good. It naturally stratifies a lot of our native seeds, so they need to be cracked open by that freeze thaw cycle. And that's another, utilizing a frost seeding is another good way to do that. And one thing I'll note too is drilling and broadcasting. With broadcasting, we tend to see a little more diversity in our forbs. With drilling, you get such even distribution of seed that our grasses are a little quicker to grow, and our forbs, we don't see them come out as much with drilling. So if you're interested in a really diverse mix or something of that sort, broadcasting can be an option for you. And broadcasting can be done in a number of ways too. We have a picture here of a little boy spreading seed out of a bucket. Usually you'll mix it with rice hulls or kitty litter or something to carry the seed, so it kind of gets a better even distribution. But you can also do it with a broadcast seeder off a tractor, off a UTV, or they even have small handheld machines that you can kind of crank, and it will spin the seed around and disperse it a little more evenly than by hand. So there's a number of ways to do that. And I'd say the biggest decision-making point would be how large of an area you have. Kind of depends on what type of equipment you want to do. You wouldn't want to hand seed a very large area by hand. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Inga. She's going to talk a little bit about prescribed burning. Oh, hold on.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Good. Okay. I muted myself differently, so I'm glad that we figured that out now. Okay. So I'll talk a little bit here about prescribed burning. So these are just the different things that I'm going to go through specifically. This will be a little bit more in depth than the other management options. Basically, we'll start off talking about why you might choose burning over a different management strategy, different folks that do burning, walking through the steps of planning a burn if you're doing it yourself. And then we'll also talk through some of the factors affecting the burn itself. So like the day of the burn, basically. Planning the burn is a really critical step, which is why we're spending a little bit more time talking about this. The burn plan, it helps you document the process of your burn, and it also helps with just the liability that's associated with fire. NRCS and FSA both require you to have a burn plan. When we're talking through some of these different aspects of the burn and the different things that I'll bring up, a lot of that is based on the Iowa DNR fire policy, which is also available on our website, or I can share links to that with you. Fire is a safe, efficient, effective management tool if it's used correctly. So making sure you're doing that planning beforehand is important. So first up, why would you choose burning? When is burning a good option for management? So for forbs, also known as flowers and grasses, fire can help promote seed production, and it can also scarify the seed. So like when Tabitha was talking about that cold stratification with the seed.
It was your CRP land.
Oh.
Was that a question? Okay, I'll keep going, maybe. It can help break open some of that seed and make it grow more effectively. Burning also can help simulate the historic conditions. So Tabitha with grazing talked a little bit about bison. Fire is also a tool that's been on Iowa grasslands for a very, very, very long time. Fire is also one of the best choices for management if you're concerned about thistle issues. Especially if you're able to couple it with timely cutting and spraying re-sprouts from your thistles. Interseeding is also something to consider if you're burning because of a thistle issue or in conjunction with a thistle issue. Again, considering like what you have, the good vegetation that you want to take over in that area when the thistles are being attacked. So this is a chart that I like just because it kind of shows the effect of burn timing on different sorts of plant communities. Again, looking at these dates, you'll have to keep in mind the primary nesting season here in Iowa. So you're not able to burn for required management from May 15 to August 1st. But for example, if we're looking at like a warm season grass stand, so we're thinking, oh, we want to, boost up our warm season grasses. It looks like the best time for us to burn will be sometime in the late spring. So between April 15th and May 15th. Okay. So who can burn? There's a variety of different folks who offer burning services. There are different local contractors, and your NRCS office maintains a list of those people who have reached out to the office. We can also help you get that list if needed. Definitely recommend contacting those folks sooner rather than later. Also, in some areas, Tabitha can also help with this, I think, but some Pheasants Forever chapters also do burning, so that's something to keep in mind. Make sure that you're getting an invoice from your contractor. Some local fire departments will also burn. Make sure that you're also getting an invoice for their time. And then you can also potentially burn if you have a burn plan, if you have enough crew members, and if you have proper equipment for it. So when we're talking about invoices, that's both to just document the process that you completed that management. Tabitha brought up cost share a little bit earlier. We can't say 100% whether or not you have cost share on something, but if you reach out to your FSA office, they can help you figure that out. Just depending on when you signed up, you might have a different amount of cost share potentially available for different kinds of management. And the only way, if it's available, the only way you'll be able to get it is if you have that record of invoices that are detailed and documenting what it was that was purchased, how much, when, names, etc. So burn plans are very important. So NRCS and FSA require you to have a burn plan if you're doing prescribed burning as management. And almost anyone can write a burn plan. Tabitha and I can write burn plans because we have firefighter training through the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. But even when we write them, the landowner still needs to sign the burn plan and assume the liability for it. You yourself can write a burn plan. You can use this template, which I'll talk about a little bit more. Contractors, especially for-profit contractors, should provide their own. They have complicated insurance situations and they need to do their own burn plans. We don't write burn plans for them. FSA and NRCS, although they require you to have a burn plan, they will not write it for you and they will not sign off on it. That is not something that they are able to do. Definitely recommend starting early as far as planning your burn, figuring out what kind of conditions you're going to be looking for. And we can help you get a template. This is the first page of the NRCS burn plan template, but there are other options out there. So we can get you this template. We can also help you if you need to get maps, if you just want to talk through what your burn plan might look like, or if you want more assistance, we can help with that. The main goal of the burn plan is that it should be useful to you and also to your crew. It should be documenting the steps that you're taking, what kind of preparation you're doing, basically why you're doing what you're doing, why that burn is happening and when it's happening. So a little bit more of thinking about when you're planning your burn. These are all things that are going to be specific to the site that you're working on. So thinking about what kind of fuels are out there for the fire, which just means what kind of vegetation there is, If it's super tall, if it's like 6 foot tall, really thick grass, that's going to be different than if you have pretty short, just like flower species, stemmier species. The density of your fuels is going to be important. So if you have trees or anything that's dead and down, brush piles, those things will all burn very differently, especially compared to fine fuels. So like your grasses and your forbs or flowers. And then also thinking about if you have anything that might produce a firebrand. So that would be a fuel, for example, like Phragmites, which is a really tall invasive grass. Depending on how fast it burns, it can throw off sparks. So it's just something you want to keep in mind as you're planning your burn. Also think about the topography. A lot of areas we work in are pretty flat, but if there is a slope, fire burns faster uphill than it does downhill. And then the aspect of the slope can also affect fire behavior. So on your north slope, it's going to tend to be damper and cooler, just because of the climate. So the fire is going to tend to burn more slowly. Access is very important. So when you're thinking about access, you're thinking about yourself, but you're also thinking about emergency services and other people that might need to access the area. So keep in mind fences, where the field drives are, if you can drive over them, or if you need to get permission from your neighbors to access the site in a better way. If there's a 911 address, definitely note that, make sure that your crew knows, or a nearby intersection where you could potentially meet emergency services. And then we also recommend carrying side cutters just in case you do end up needing to cut a fence for some reason. Other things to keep in mind specific to your site are water resources. If there's a nearby hydrant that you can use, if you're using water as one of your tools, or maybe you have, a pump set up in a ditch somewhere that you're gonna pump water from. So trying to plan what kind of burn conditions you're looking for, the way that you think about it is like you're writing a prescription for that ground. You're saying, these are the conditions that I'm looking for specifically for this burn that I'm going to complete. And there are many factors that play into this. This is taken directly from that NRCS burn plan template. So they give you kind of this range of conditions, and then you figure out what specifically you're looking for your site. So you're looking for an air temperature between 40 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You're looking for a relative humidity or RH between 30 and 60%. You want the soil damp to the touch at the time of the burn. Tabitha and I talked about it. I think it has to do with kind of like those long-term moisture regimes and climate. So, if you're in a long-term drought, the ground's already really dry, your vegetation is going to burn differently and maybe be more volatile than if you have that moisture in the soil still. All of those are very important, but probably one of the most important things that you'll need to look at is the wind. So both the wind speed as well as the direction of the wind. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. For the wind speed, you want something that's sustained, typically somewhere between like 5 to 12 miles per hour. So typically it's kind of on the lower edge of that 5 to 15 mile per hour range. But you need that wind both to drive the fire itself, to fuel it with oxygen, as well as to carry your smoke. So sometimes folks think, oh, like a light and variable wind condition is good, but that's actually a lot more unpredictable, knowing where your smoke's going to go, if you're going to have enough oxygen to carry that fire, and what could potentially change if you're going to go from light and variable to a wind direction that's going to send smoke straight over a road. It's not a condition that you want to run into. So when you're considering that wind direction, you want to think about anything that you don't want downwind. So some things, for example, livestock operations, roads, whether it's like your neighbor's lane or an interstate, those are going to have very different implications if you send fire or smoke specifically over them. Don't try to send fire over roads. Any of your neighbors. So especially think about maybe you have a neighbor to the fire area who's, on oxygen, or maybe there's a daycare or a school or a town, who it is that's nearby. You'll also want to think about power lines. Smoke that has a lot of dense particulate matter in it can actually arc electricity. So you want to avoid contacting power lines with heavy smoke. And you're thinking about both the smoke and the fire aspect. So if there's continuous grass in one direction, or even if your neighbor has a field that has a lot of residue in it, if it's something that could potentially carry fire that's downwind, you'll want to make sure that you have a good fire break in place there, which we'll talk about in a moment. Probably most of you would be considering a grass or a prairie fire, so you want to look about 1 to 3 miles away from the burn, just depending on how large that area is. That's kind of the rough range in the Iowa DNR smoke policy of where the impact from that smoke could be. You'll want to contact your neighbors both while you're doing that planning and then also the day of the burn, just to, give them a chance if they want to be out for the day, make sure they close their windows, turn off their air exchange, etc. So when you're going through and making your maps, you really want to think about what different hazards there might be on your burn unit. So here is a list of different things you'll want to consider. So roads, both because smoke and fire can pose a risk to passerby or traffic who might want to stop and put their head out the window, as well as to any people on your crew that you might have working along a road. You want to keep that in mind. And think about maybe you're going to need to put up signs or have someone out there to flag and let traffic know what's going on. Power lines, we talked about dense smoke and power lines, but also making sure that you're not going to contact that with water or with equipment in any situation. Wet spots where you could potentially get a vehicle stuck. You don't want to have that and have fire coming at you. Holes, whether it means a spot that someone might twist an ankle or a cistern that somebody might fall into. Any steep terrain spots could limit where your equipment has access to, as well as be a challenge to any personnel. Any fences that are out there can limit vehicle access, or a downed fence could also be a tripping hazard. And then also snags. So any like dead trees or spots where, like, if a dead tree lit on fire, you don't want to have that blowing sparks and smoke out and creating a bigger issue. So make sure that you're just communicating all of those different hazards and anything else that might come up on a map to your crew, just so that they know where everything is. So on this map, for example, we've marked out, where there's this pile of tires that we're going to want to avoid getting on fire. We also know where the creek crossing is. So talking a little bit more about fire breaks. So fire breaks are basically what's going to keep your fire inside of where you want it to be. So inside of your burn unit. And the two basic types are existing fire breaks or created fire breaks. Existing fire breaks, those are things that are already there that you can use, whether it's a road that the fire is not going to get across, a tilled field, whether it's a body of water that's, wide enough that you're not going to get fire jumping over it, or even like mowed green turf can work in most situations. And then there's probably also situations where you're going to need to create fire breaks, and you can do that in a variety of different ways. Tabitha talked a little bit about disking to create fire breaks. So you're going to want to make sure that you have, mineral soil, and also consider that those might be really bumpy and they might be more challenging for your equipment or your personnel to get across. You can mow fire breaks. Typically, it's best if you're able to mow them in the fall and then again in the spring before you burn. That way, you're getting that dead material off, and you're giving it a chance to, start to green up a little bit. So you're not as likely to have fire come across it. Hand line, you might also have to use, maybe going from like a crop field to connect up to the road. That's something that you dig using hand tools like shovels, rakes, leaf blowers, etc. And make sure you're removing the thatch from any of those fire breaks. So dead material laying on the ground, that'll still carry fire. So again, kind of going back to thinking about different hazards or different things you might see, make sure you're clearing around any power poles or signposts, tile inlets, electric boxes, things that you don't want to burn or melt or that could create a bigger issue. Make sure you clear out around all of those areas before you're, lighting your fire. So you want your fire breaks to all be at least 4 times the height of the fuel or 15 feet in width, whichever is greater. So it just depends on what you're burning. So I'm going to talk through some of the different equipment that you want to think through. So first I'll talk about the tools. So when you think about what tools and or water you're going to use on your fire, you can think back to elementary school and taking physical science. You probably saw a diagram kind of like this one. So it's the fire triangle. We have oxygen, we have heat, and we have fuel, and you need all of those three things to have a fire. So when you're using a tool, you are working to limit one or more of these to try to control and or extinguish the fire where you don't want it. So with hand tools, we have things like flappers. You can see that in the picture here. Rakes, shovels, chainsaws, or leaf blowers. Flappers, you're going to use to smother out the fire. So you're removing oxygen to try to limit the spread. With a rake, you can move the fuel around, like you can move the grass into your burn unit or, spread it out. So then you're limiting the fuel of it. When we're talking about water resources, that might be a tank on your ATV, on your tractor, or a tank on your truck, or a backpack sprayer. Water plays multiple roles if you're using it. So it can reduce the heat of the fire, limit access to oxygen, as well as wet down the fuel so it's less available for the fire to burn. If you're using water, definitely make sure that you've checked all your hoses and your nozzles and that they're functioning the way that they need to be. Other equipment that's very important includes the clothing. So you want to make sure that you're not wearing synthetic clothing and that your crew isn't wearing synthetic clothing. Stuff like polyester, it doesn't just burn, it will actually melt onto your skin if you get contacted with fire, which is not a good situation to be in. Nomex is a material that we use a lot of the time, but basically anything non-synthetic will work, like 100% cotton or wool clothing. And then additional personal protective equipment, such as leather gloves and boots, safety glasses or goggles. If you're potentially running chainsaws or power tools, you want ear protection, and then hard hats, depending on what you're burning and what kind of tools people might be swinging around. Other equipment, make sure that you have good communication between your whole crew. So whether that's your cell phones with numbers programmed in, two-way radios, something that's going to work at the site that you're burning at. Make sure that everyone has a copy of the map, the plan, and then they also have water and food, because you never know what's going to come up or how long you might be out there. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, make sure that you have a fire source. So a drip torch, I have one pictured here. A lot of folks use those, but whether or not you are, you'll still need, a lighter, matches. You could be using fusees, something that's going to allow you to start the fire where you want to start the fire. Okay, so talking a little bit about the burn itself, the following are things that are also going to be included in your burn plan. So you're looking on the day of the burn, you're trying to figure out if the weather meets your prescription that you wrote way back, however many slides ago that was. So when we're looking at the weather, we're not just looking at the weather right at this moment, we're looking at the weather into the future as well. So some things to look out for include that forecast, like maybe there's a front moving in, it looks like here it's going to get kind of stormier later on. So maybe there's going to be rain, maybe that'll help limit the fire, but maybe the wind will pick up and something will light up that you thought was out and cold. Definitely make sure that you're abiding by any burn bans. The state fire marshal puts those in place. There are about half a dozen counties in Iowa right now that are under a burn ban, mostly out in the Less Hills, but I know Crawford County has a burn ban still. And then there's a couple counties in South Central Iowa. With droughty conditions, just make sure that you're checking in on that, because you should not be burning if there is a burn ban in place. Also, you'll want to avoid red flag warnings. So here on the National Weather Service site, you can see when they have this red flag on it, basically that means that there's low fuel moisture, so it's been dry for a long time. There's low relative humidity and there's high winds. So those are conditions where you're more likely to have a fire spread somewhere that you don't want a fire to be. Those are conditions when you're more likely to have a wildfire. So you don't want to be out lighting things on fire at that point in time. Weather can get very complicated. Like you can take whole classes on fire weather, planning for burns, etc. But just a couple very easy things to keep in mind. Sun typically increases fire behavior. So if you're burning on a cloudy day, you're probably not going to have as active of a fire, which might be a good or a bad thing. Sun tends to make the fire burn hotter. And then you'll also usually have your most active fire behavior between about 2 and 5 p.m. in the afternoon. That's just when you'll usually have the lowest humidities and the highest temperatures. So keeping in mind, even if you start burning at noon, around that 2 p.m. mark, you might see a lot more fire activity than you were seeing earlier, just as things dry out. So on the day of your burn, you want to make sure that you are contacting your local sheriff or dispatch. You can use a non-emergency number, just so that they know what's going on in case they have to come out there, but also in case somebody sees smoke and calls, just so that they know what's going on and they don't have to dispatch people unnecessarily. Make sure that you're contacting your neighbors that we talked about earlier on. And then that you're inspecting the site and the fire breaks. So maybe you just mowed your fire break yesterday, but maybe a tree fell down over it or someone put a bale of hay down. Hay burns forever. You don't want to light that on fire accidentally. So make sure you're looking everything over. Make sure your equipment's all in working order. Everything's fueled up. Your water tanks are full. You're ready to go. And then you're briefing your crew. So you're going to want to get everyone together. You're going to want to talk through the plan. You're going to want to make sure that you have one person in charge who people are going to respond to, who's able to make those calls with whatever steps you're taking going forward. Make sure everyone has maps and plans and the equipment that they're going to need. Everyone has phone numbers. And then if you have any contingency plans, keep that in mind too. So maybe there's a little piece of grass nearby. Maybe it doesn't matter if the fire gets in there, but just make sure you know ahead of time what you would do if the ditch lights on fire or a brush pile lights on fire that you weren't planning on. In the case that your fire escapes, make sure that you're calling 911. It's much better to deal with those emergency situations before there is life or property at risk. So in terms of making the plan for how you're burning, the way that it is typically done is basically with using these two tools, so backfire and headfire. It's going to be a very short rundown, but we can definitely get more in depth with it in your specific situation if you need. Essentially, you have your wind direction. So here are winds coming in from the northwest. So that means that we're going to start our fire down here at the southeast corner. When you're working with backfire, it means you're burning into or against the wind, and it spreads a lot slower because you don't have the wind driving it into fuel. So you're going to want to start building up that backfire, building up your black line. So basically you're making your fire break wider before you kind of start to move around the rest of your fire, and definitely before you get to this point where you're lighting a head fire. So your head fire is when you're burning in the direction of the wind. So here we're lighting our fire and the wind is going to carry it into all of this unburned fuel here. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of black line already on our downwind side. So the fire and smoke, et cetera, aren't going to, carry through that. Head fire is faster. It can also be more dangerous because it doesn't stay as long on the ground. Sometimes it doesn't consume the fuels as fully as a backfire. So sometimes it'll just like burn the tops off the grass. Backfire also gives more of a chance for like those little critters to escape. Some of them, like insects, can move pretty slowly. So giving them a chance to get out while the fire is burning can definitely be helpful. But both of those tools together allow you to totally enclose your unit. So, light all the way around and make sure that you have basically what's called like a solid black line all the way around the unit where you've put fire to everything and everything is contained inside. Here's just another example where we have wind coming in from the northwest side. We're going to start lighting down here on the southeast corner. Just as shorthand, BP is drop point. So you can use it to shorthand when you're talking to people, say like, okay, we're going to start lighting at drop point 1. And then here we have 2 fire crews, and they're each gonna start igniting. One of them is gonna ignite to drop point 2, and that we're gonna do that well. The second crew is gonna ignite up to drop point 3. So we're kind of flanking the wind here, building up that nice black line. And then after that's completed, we have crew 1 and crew 2 igniting all the way to drop point 4 to totally contain our fire. We want to make sure that we're not sending a head fire across the unit until we have the black line fully established on that downwind side, and that you're listening to your burn boss and making sure that you're communicating what's going on. Throughout this whole thing, you want to make sure everyone's watching the wind, watching the fire and the smoke behavior, trying to predict what could happen. Like if you're burning and all of a sudden, like you thought there was going to be a west wind all day, and then you see like the fire switch to where it's blowing to the south or something. That's something that you're going to want to make sure that you're communicating for the rest of the crew. I know meteorologists work hard to make weather predictions, but sometimes it's just not exactly what's going on out there. So always be alert. This is just another quick example. On this map, I'll just highlight, it shows some spots that we could access water from if we need to. This one also shows what some of the surrounding areas are. So we know that this field's all in row crop. We know over here there's WSG, stands for warm season grasses. So that's a line that we're going to want to be extra careful while we're burning there, just because we know that there's more grass that could burn on the other side of our line. Yeah, so we're going to want to make sure that we're following whatever ignition sequence we set up, that we're using that prescription. Everything might not burn, but we still want to put fire to it. At the end, we're going to do mop up. So we're going to go all the way around the perimeter, make sure that at least 20 feet inside to your unit, there's nothing that's smoking or smoldering or burning, and then continue monitoring that for at least 48 hours. Check and recheck. If you have a front come through, even something that you thought was out, the wind could pick up and reignite it. And then when you're done, you can turn your invoices into the Farm Service Agency. And then either you can keep your burn plan on file in case you need to refer back to it later. Occasionally NRCS offices are willing, once the burn's totally complete, sometimes they'll stick it into your file just to hold on to it for the next time you might need it. So Tabitha will talk a little bit more now about communicating with FSA and NRCS.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Inga. Burning is such a fun topic. I always love listening to it and talking about it. And you're right, we have been in a burn ban in Crawford County and a lot of counties in the Les Hills. And we have a lot of experienced firefighters in the Les Hills that have said that the spot forecasts have been very inaccurate lately, making folks think it might be a good day to burn, but not considering that long-term drought that we've had. Our fuels are just so dry. So don't let a little dusting of snow fool you and think that there's enough moisture out there. We are in a drought, so you know, our snow is melting very quickly and things are drying out really fast too. So just keep that in mind while burning. Yeah, so just a note here on communicating with the Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. If you would like to switch to a different management activity, we usually make you pick one at the very beginning of your contract, but for some of you that could have been 4, 5, or 6 years ago, and things might have changed for you now, and you want to switch your practice. Say you signed up for tillage, but you want to do a prescribed fire this year. You're going to want to talk to us and we can just make a quick note in your conservation plan. It's no problem to update your practice at all. And then once the activity is complete, we're going to need to sign an 848 with the Farm Service Agency. You don't need to remember that. You can just walk into the office and say, I've done my required management, and they'll have you fill out that form. You're going to want to bring all necessary invoices, seed tags, receipts. Even if you burned yourself, please make an accurate invoice as you can. You know, take into consideration your time is valuable, your fuel is valuable. You know, so don't short yourself there. And then just a note that the seed tags are most often forgotten about. They get thrown away on those bags, so make sure to save the seed tags for the Farm Service Agency too. There we go. And then there is some ongoing maintenance that needs to be done outside of the required management activity. So the required management activity is going to happen usually just once throughout that contract. But as you know, it's not just a kind of leave it for all the other years. You're going to want to be out there on the CRP, evaluating the stand, seeing if you have any issues coming up, and noticing the good things too. And how do I continue to promote the good things that are going on out there? So we're going to need to manage invasive species, keep out volunteer trees, and maintain the cover. And so if you need to do any of these things, there's a number of ways you can go about them. You're going to want to talk to the Farm Service Agency and make sure to let them know that you're doing something, especially if you're doing it in the primary nesting season. You're going to need to let them know. But spot mowing, spot spraying, doing an extra prescribed fire could be really beneficial. So cutting and treating volunteer trees, and maybe reseeding areas that have heavier use, tire ruts, etc. So this management activity usually in a typical average CRP occurs once in a 10-year contract. And so really, that's not a ton of management. And so, by the time the contract nears the end, it might need another burn, say in year 9. If you did it in year 4, it's been 5 years. So just thinking about things like that. So thistles is one, I would say kind of common. If you're talking about noxious weeds in CRP, it might be the most common. We have bull and musk thistles. Those are kind of larger, taller thistles. They are biennial. Those are not to be worried about too terribly much. You can dig them out with a spade. You can mow them, and they have a 2-year life cycle, and then they're done. The Candida thistles are a little more of a problem for us because they're a perennial. So once you have them getting started, those little spiky things will continue to live for a long time, making a lot of seed and creating a bigger headache if they are given the opportunity. So a couple of things you can do to manage for Candida thistles. The first being is to mow them sometime maybe in mid-June, I believe is when they first start to flower. Once they have a white fluffy seed head and that fluff is drifting away, you are too late. So you really have to be on it with your timing of mowing these thistles, because once they start to flower, you got to get out there and mow them so that the seed is no longer viable, because they produce a ton of seed. Mowing alone is not going to kill them, as they are super tough. So they might even try to flower and put off seed again in the same year. So you might want to pay attention and have to mow them again a second time. But mowing will reduce the amount of seed that you have out there that they're putting out. And so that is a good thing. One way to try to terminate this plant would be to use herbicide. And so when you're using herbicide, you want to be as targeted as you can stomach, especially if you're in a diverse native planting of CRP, because if you spray way too large of areas and have these big dead patches, what is going to move in when there's already a ton of thistle seed out there is more thistles. So you really want to be as targeted as you can manage, so that you leave the surrounding vegetation alive and well, so it can fill into the gaps created when you terminate these thistles. Using an aminopyralid is really good. It's a broadleaf herbicide, like a milestone. These have been shown to not be as detrimental to a lot of our native forbs. So if you have a little bit of overspray, drift, I hope we're not broadcasting. We shouldn't really be broadcasting, but this chemical won't be as bad on our other forb species that we want to move into the area. And doing this, timing of this spray can be super beneficial too. So in the middle of October, when we've had a hard frost or two, a lot of our other vegetation has gone dormant. Thistles, being so tough as they are, will remain green and survive through a few frosts before they finally decide to call it quits for the year. That can be a really good time to hit them, because they're just going to take their energy right back down to their root system, take that chemical down to their root system. And then you're avoiding more harm to the surrounding vegetation as it's already gone dormant. So sod forming invasive grasses. So sometimes when we have, especially in our native CRPs, they can become dominated with brome or reed canary grass, which isn't the most desirable cover type Both of them are introduced cool season grasses, and they can take over. They spread by rhizomes, so they just keep shooting lateral roots off, and then they grow a thick thatch. So there's a number of things you can do to set these back. I always think when we have this issue, it's not we're gonna treat the issue one time right now this year with this management technique. It's really kind of an ongoing management philosophy that will over time tilt the system to one of less brome or less red canary. So the first thing would be you can consider timing fire to set back those cool season grasses. Inga showed us earlier that chart with the thumbs up and the thumbs down. That's a really good chart if you that's on our burn plan if you ever have one of those, and it can show at what times of the year will the fire create what response for which types of species. So for cool season grasses, hitting them later in the spring, maybe in May through June would be a really good time to hit our cool season grasses. They've already done a lot of their growing. They've put a lot of their energy out for the year already. Hitting them at that time really can set them back. Spraying can also be used, and interseeding a really competitive and more diverse native species can also help. Okay. So stump treating. So volunteer trees aren't allowed in CRP. There's a number of ways to get rid of and try to prevent volunteer trees. One could be using prescribed fire more frequently to kill our small seedlings. Prescribed fire works really well on cedars in particular. And obviously mechanical removal works too, chainsaw, something of that nature to cut those trees and get them out of there. If you cut a tree, you're going to want to treat it with a chemical around the outside so that it doesn't re-sprout. If you are cutting cedars, they do not need to be sprayed or have any chemical applied, as if you cut them below their lowest branch, they will not re-sprout. And then finally, maintaining the cover. So as you can see here, this ground was a little mushy, and driving on it at that time can disturb the cover that's going on there. So if we, incidental driving is okay on CRP, but if we start to see lanes or the cover is disturbed in this way, those heavy use areas need to be reseeded to meet the contract requirements. All right, and then finally we have status reviews. Was I handing this off to you, Inga, for this one?
Yes,
okay.
I think so. So I'll just talk super briefly. Status reviews are ongoing periodically throughout your CRP contract. There are several early on to make sure everything's established, and then towards the end of the contract, we or other USDA staff members are out checking those CRPs, making sure that they're up to specification. Should you be looking to re-enroll, we're doing them at least a year in advance, so it should give you time to do some kind of maintenance in advance. However, keep in mind, like doing ongoing maintenance, treating a knee-high tree is a lot easier than dealing with a 10-year-old tree. So making sure that you're doing periodic checks too. We don't always see everything. It's your property. Make sure that you're looking. If you have questions or need to ask something about a technical question, definitely feel free to ask us or your local office. As far as like equipment and local contractors, county conservation boards occasionally have equipment that they'll rent out, or soil and water conservation districts, whether that's like a grass drill or a drip torch. Sometimes there's different options for those. Each county also maintains that contractor list that I referred to. So those can be very beneficial sources of information. And finally, here is our contact information. We will send you an email with a lot of this information, like the burn plan template, this contact information again, a copy of the slides. But yeah, and if you have any other questions, especially about like wildlife or financial assistance or anything, we can definitely try to help you out, hook you up with some resources. we are happy to take questions that you might have at this time. I don't know if there's anything. I don't see anything in the chat. But if anyone has any question, ooh, should I do that?
Sorry, that was me.
That's okay.
I'm flipping through all.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or you can definitely reach out to us on your own time if you want to. Let me go back to that contact slide. Or yeah, unmute, chat, whatever, unless you have something to add, Tabitha. Or if any of our USDA folks on the call have something to add.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, I would just open it up at this time for any questions. For some reason, I can't see the chat button right now. So you said there's none in the chat, right, Inga?
I didn't see any. I hope I looked correctly. It says you're still controlling my screen. So
Oh, maybe I'll stop and then that will be there.
maybe.
Perfect. So yeah, we don't have any questions in the chat. I'm going to stop the recording here.